The road into Dry Creek was nothing more than a ribbon of dust pressed flat by wagon wheels and hooves. Along its edges, sun-bleached sage leaned and rattled in the wind like a choir of dry bones. The hour was late afternoon, when the sky turned gold and the world seemed to pause under its weight. That was when she came, Martha Calhoun, a carpet bag swinging heavy in her hand, her shoes worn thin as the boards of the saloon porch she soon passed. She did not expect applause, and she did not receive it. Folks on porches simply lifted their eyes as if a stray dog had wandered too close. A man spat into the street. A pair of women bent their heads together, whispering so sharp you could almost see the words cut through the air. It had been only a month since word spread that Martha's betrothed had left her, walked off to Kansas with a banker's daughter whose dowry shone brighter than Martha's earnest heart. In a town like this, where gossip traveled faster than dust storms, she was already condemned. A woman left behind was not a woman free. She was a woman marked. She carried herself straight despite it, though the effort left her eyes hollow. At the mercantile, she laid out her needlework, small, careful stitches, roses embroidered on linen, hems neat as a hymn book's edge. For a fair price, she said quietly. But the storekeeper, Mr. Albee, scratched his whiskered chin and shook his head. "Don't need it," he muttered, though Martha caught the flicker of pity in his eyes. Behind her, a woman snickered. That evening she sat on the edge of the well outside the livery, her carpet bag at her feet, her stomach a hollow cave. The sky deepened into copper, and shadows stretched long as regrets. She did not cry. There was no dignity in tears when the town already believed her broken. It was then she noticed him. Elias Boone, tall as a cottonwood, shoulders broad from years of wrestling earth and cattle into obedience. His hat shaded half his face, but the other half caught the dying light. Strong jaw, weathered skin, eyes steady but unreadable. He had been in town long enough for everyone to know him, though few could say much of who he was. They called him quiet, solitary, a man who kept his land the way a wolf keeps to his den. He stepped out of the feed store, a sack of grain slung over one shoulder. People parted to let him pass, not from fear, but from the quiet weight he carried around him. He walked as though the world owed him nothing, and in return he asked nothing of it. Martha's heart knocked against her ribs with something reckless. Before she could lose her courage, she stood, dust clinging to her skirts, and walked toward him. He stopped when she stepped into his path. Her voice trembled, though she forced it steady. "I can't pay you," she said, "but I'll be yours. I can cook, tend animals, mend what's torn. I don't ask for much. Only a roof, a chance." The town grew still around them. A man leaned against a post, smirking. Hester Dobbins, the widow with a tongue like a snake's tail, hissed under her breath, "Lord have mercy." Even Sheriff Amos Pike, leaning against the saloon rail, straightened at the sound of such words. Elias studied her, the sack of grain still resting on his shoulder. He did not speak. The silence stretched long enough for Martha's cheeks to burn as if she'd struck her own dignity down before the entire town. Then, slowly, Elias shifted the weight from his shoulder, set the sack down, and removed his hat. He held it against his chest, eyes still fixed on hers. And he smiled. It wasn't broad. It wasn't the smile of a man mocking or pitying. It was the faintest lift of the mouth, the kind that said, "I see you. I hear you. I know the hunger that lives inside your bones." The murmurs grew louder behind them. Sheriff Pike's voice cut through. "Boone, you best think twice. That woman will bring you more trouble than help." Hester's voice followed like a whip. "She's a shame, Elias. Mark my words. Shame breeds ruin." Elias didn't so much as glance at them. He simply bent, lifted the sack again, and tipped his head for Martha to follow. She did. The two of them walked side by side out of Dry Creek, their shadows stretching long across the dust road until the town was nothing but a smudge in the fading light. Behind them, the murmurs kept. Ahead of them, silence, wide, waiting, full of possibility. The Boone Ranch sat on a lonely rise, where the land rolled out in every direction like an ocean of grass and stone. The house itself was plain, 2 rooms, unpainted board silver by sun, roof patched with tin. It was not the home of a wealthy man, but of one who lived close to the bone. Martha's first morning there, she woke to silence. No bells, no church chimes, no town noise. Only the low moan of wind pressing against the boards and the shuffle of hooves in the corral. She rose from the cot he had offered her, wrapped her shawl tight, and stepped into a kitchen barren but clean. The shelves held only coffee beans, flour, and a sack of salt pork. She boiled water, ground beans, and fried thin slices of pork in a pan blackened from years of use. Elias came in with the dawn still clinging to his shoulders, shirt damp from sweat, the smell of horses clinging to him. He sat at the table without a word, hat resting on his knee. She set the plate before him. He ate without flourish, steady and grateful. When the last bite was gone, he nodded once, wordless thanks. It was not much, but it was more than pity, more than scorn. It was respect. Days stretched into a rhythm. Elias worked the fence lines, mended troughs, moved cattle to pasture. Martha scrubbed the floorboards until they gleamed, hung linens to dry in the wind, and baked bread that filled the little house with warmth it hadn't known in years. They spoke little, but silence between them did not feel empty. It felt patient. One afternoon, while sweeping out the small front room, Martha found a thin book tucked behind a cracked shelf, a family Bible worn from handling. On its inside page was written a name, Caleb Boone, 1862. She ran her hand over the faded ink, sensing the ghost of a story. That evening, when Elias came in, she asked softly, "Was Caleb your kin?" He paused in the act of removing his boots. "Brother." His voice was gravel, low and rough. "What became of him?" "Fever." The word was clipped final, as if spoken too often. Yet something in his eyes, an ache, deep and guarded, told her more than the word ever could. She said nothing further. She did not need to. He rose, washed his hands, and sat at the table where she placed the bread. That night, the silence between them was heavy, but it was shared. It was in the smallest gestures that something began to shift. One morning, when she came into the kitchen, she found a jar on the table. Inside were wildflowers, yellow sunbursts and small white blooms. She knew he must have placed them there at dawn, before leaving for fields. He never mentioned it. A week later, as he dozed in the chair after supper, she noticed the cuff of his shirt worn and torn. She threaded a needle, stitched the fray until it looked new. The next morning, when he pulled it on, his eyes lingered on the seam, then flicked to her. He didn't speak, only gave the faintest nod, but she felt the warmth of it all the same. Each act became a stone in the foundation of something fragile and growing. But the world beyond the ranch did not forget. On a supply run into town, Martha felt eyes follow her every step. Women at the dry goods store pretended not to see her, then turned away with lifted brows. Men outside the saloon muttered as she passed. And Sheriff Amos Pike, ever the watcher, tipped his hat with cool disapproval. "Miss Calhoun," he said, voice low, "a woman ties herself to the wrong man. She'll carry that rope all her life. You best think what you're doing." She held her chin steady, but her hands trembled when she returned home. Elias noticed, though he asked nothing. He poured her a cup of coffee instead, slid across the table, and let her sit with her silence. Sometimes care was not in words, but in the weight of a cup offered without question. One night, when the wind was high and rattled the shutters like a thing alive, she broke the quiet herself. The lamplight flickered as she whispered, almost to the shadows, "I thought I'd be a wife by now. Thought I'd be someone's someone. Instead, I'm a debt no man wants." The words hung there, brittle, almost shameful. Elias leaned back in his chair, face hidden by shadow. For a long while, he said nothing. She thought he hadn't heard. But then, in that slow, steady voice of his, he answered, "Not a debt, a soul. That's worth more." Her breath caught. He didn't meet her eyes, but his words struck like water on dry ground. She turned away before he could see her tears. From then on, the silence between them was no longer just survival. It was a space where dignity slowly rebuilt itself. Each day, each gesture, stitched together something neither had dared hope for. The beginning of belonging. By late autumn, the Boone Ranch bore traces of her hand. The floors shone with polish. Curtains swayed at the windows. and the table no longer felt barren. Even Elias moved differently through the house, less like a ghost, more like a man returning each day to something waiting. But outside those walls, the world did not rest. Whispers in Dry Creek had grown sharper. It was no secret now. Martha Calhoun lived under Elias Boone's roof, and no preacher had spoken vows over them. Each time she went for supplies, she felt the sting of stares like nettles against her skin. Even those who once pitied her now let their eyes harden with judgment. The loudest voice belonged to Hester Dobbins. She cornered Martha outside the Mercantile one gray afternoon, her thin lips curling. "You think scrubbing that man's floors makes you a wife?" Hester sneered. "You're nothing but a kept woman, child. Shame doesn't wash out." Martha stood frozen, throat tight, until Elias appeared from the wagon, a sack slung over his shoulder. Hester quieted, but her smirk lingered as Elias set the sack in the wagon bed and guided Martha away without a word. Still, the poison of those words stayed with her all the way home. The next evening, Sheriff Amos Pike rode up, dust rising behind his horse. He sat tall in the saddle, brim shadowing his eyes. "Boone," he said, his voice steady but edged, "you know this can't stand. Folks are talking. You either do right by that woman, or put her out before the town turns ugly." Elias leaned against the porch rail, arms crossed, face unreadable. Martha, standing inside the doorway, could feel the weight of the moment pressing her chest. "Not the town decision," Elias said finally. "It'll be made theirs if you keep silent," Amos warned. "Men get restless when they smell scandal." The sheriff reined his horse and rode off, leaving the air thick with the echo of his warning. That night, Elias sat alone at the table, staring at the lamplight. Martha folded clothes in the corner, her hands trembling. At last she whispered, "He's right, Elias. I brought you nothing but trouble." He lifted his eyes to her, steady as stone. "Trouble's not the word I'd use." "What word, then?" For a long moment he said nothing, and she thought he would stay silent as always. But then he murmured, "Home." The word nearly broke her. Still, the threat lingered. It was at the Sunday gathering, Dry Creek's small congregation collected on benches outside the church, that everything came to a head. Elias had not been in months, but that day he rode in beside Martha. Heads turned at once. Murmurs rose like flies over carrion. When they dismounted, a group of men at the church steps blocked their path. One laughed harshly. "Didn't think the Boone place came with a boarding house for strays." Another added, "Best keep your cattle locked up, Elias. Never know what might wander in." Laughter broke, sharp as a whip. Martha felt heat climb her neck. She gripped her shawl tight, wishing the ground would swallow her whole. Elias stood still, face unreadable. For years, he had carried silence like armor. But now, for her, he let it fall. "She stays with me," Elias said, his voice calm but carrying over the crowd. "And none of you'll touch her name again." The word struck like a hammer. The laughter died. The men shifted uneasily, their bravado crumbling in the face of Elias Boone's stillness, the kind of stillness that promised unyielding force beneath it. Then, before the eyes of the whole town, Elias reached for Martha's hand. He held it openly, his thumb brushing the back of her knuckles with a tenderness that silenced even the boldest tongues. For Martha, the world tilted. For the first time, she was not hiding, not shrinking, not waiting for shame to claim her. She stood in the open, claimed by a man who saw her not as burden, but as worth. Sheriff Pike watched, jaw tight. For a moment, it seemed he might step forward. Instead, he tipped his hat with something like reluctant respect and turned away. The congregation filed into the church, quieter now. No one spoke another word against them. On the ride home, Martha's eyes blurred with tears. She did not try to hide. Elias said nothing, but his hand never left the reins, or hers. That evening, back at the ranch, she entered the kitchen to find another jar on the table, filled with wildflowers. But this time there were 2 mugs beside it, steam curling up like soft prayers. She touched the rim of her mug, then looked at him, standing near the window with his hat in hand. For the first time, he wasn't guarded. His eyes met hers fully, warmth breaking to the weathered steel of his face. "Elias," she said softly. It was the first time she had spoken his name without fear, and he smiled, not faint, not guarded, but open, as if the long silence of his life had finally been broken.